Good afternoon, everybody. My name is D.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted to be here with all of you, virtually and in person, to celebrate two books under the genre discussion title of Decolonizing the Wellness myth. We are welcoming Kerri Kelly and Dalia Kinsey for each of their books. So Dalia Kinsey is a queer Black registered dietitian, keynote speaker, the creator of the Body Liberation for All podcast, and author of Decolonizing Wellness, a QTBIPOC-Centered guide to escape the diet trap, heal your self-image, and achieve body liberation. On a mission to spread joy, reduce suffering, and eliminate health disparities in the LGBTQIA+ and BIPOC community, Dalia rejects diet culture and teaches people to use nutrition as a self-care and personal empowerment tool to counter the damage of systemic oppression. Dalia works at the intersection of holistic wellness and social justice, continually creating wellness tools and resources that center the most vulnerable individuals that hold multiple marginalized identities. And I'll be dropping Dalia's website into the chat for folks who are watching at home, but for folks who are in the house with us, you can find her work at daliakinsey.com. She's in conversation with author Kerri Kelly, who is a community organizer, wellness activist, and author of the book we're celebrating today, American Detox, The Myth of Wellness and How We Can Truly Heal. Kerri is recognized across communities for her work to bridge transformational practice with social justice. She's been teaching yoga for over 20 years and is known for making waves in the wellness industry by challenging norms, disrupting systems, and mobilizing people to act. Her leadership has inspired Citizen Well, a movement to democratize well-being for all, and is committed to creating the systems and conditions where everyone can thrive. So welcome to both of you. We are so excited to have you here. We are excited to have all of our friends watching at home and here with us in this space. We're going to encourage folks to ask questions at any time in the chat, and I'll vocalize them. And for y'all who are physically in the room, we invite you to ask questions towards the end. So, Kerri, Dalia, thank you so much for being with us. We're really excited about it for you folks.
Thank you, and to the entire Charis community and family. I'm gonna start us off with our first question, which I'm so excited. First of all, thank you for this book. I learned so much from you in this book and obviously resonated with so much of what you wrote about and the discourse and the subject matter. And we're going to get into that a lot in this conversation. But my first question is really around what called you to this book and why it was the right time for you to write this book.
It feels like so much of this has been brewing, maybe for 20 years, maybe more than that. But I didn't feel empowered to speak directly to people of color or to speak directly to anybody who wasn't white cis het in writing. I had this palpable fear that there would be retaliation, whether just in professional circles or whether from friends, family, relatives, about speaking directly to my queerness, speaking directly to being a person of color. And it felt like the fear that I had was overwhelmed by the need to address baseline stress levels in people with multiple marginalized identities when I felt like my head was going to explode in the early stages of the pandemic. Dealing with the pandemic and the second wave of the civil rights movement at the same time, finding out how many people I had unintentionally invited into my space, into my world, that thought it was strange for me to feel aligned with the words Black Lives Matter. Like, on what planet would I not resonate with that? But I had unintentionally allowed people in that weren't committed or even interested in anti-racism and that accepted me as an assimilated Black person who they assumed didn't have any interest in equity or safety for Black people. So once I realized I created that environment and I started to reconcile or really confront all the internalized fear I was working through, internalized white supremacy that I've been trying to work with and work through for years in therapy and in coaching, once I realized that this was gonna be a major stepping point or a push for growth, to feel the fear and do it anyway, I knew that it was finally time for me to say what I've been wanting to say.
I love that.
And for you, since we both wrote our books during the pandemic,
Ooh, yes.
what made you feel like this was the time, or was this something that was already in the works before the pandemic even started?
For me, well, so I just want to speak to like writing during the pandemic was, and I'm sure you can relate, like was a visceral, profound experience. Because so much of what we were both writing about was literally playing out right before our eyes in real time. I actually started writing this book around the time of the 2016 election. Same thing, like I had been sort of playing around with the idea of like, what is the offering that I need to make to this conversation, or what is the book that's appropriate, right, and productive for me to write, given my lived experience, given my role and my responsibility. And then after the 2016 election, I had been organizing the wellness community for many, many years with the assumption that this like enormous, growing, emerging, supposedly conscious community could be organized as a force for change, as a force for good, right? As a force for transformation. And after the 2016 election, when, what was it, 54% of white women voted for Donald Trump, I was like, oh shit,
Yeah.
I think I have to write a different book than like the like rah, let's go wellness community, let's become, the progressive version of, the far right Tea Party. I was like, oh shit, I actually have to write a book about how we've gotten lost and sidetracked, and how wellness isn't in fact the panacea that we thought it was. That wellness is very much entrenched and indoctrinated in the very ideologies and logics of oppression that we're trying to liberate ourselves from. So that was sort of, the reckoning that I came to at that time. And that's when I really started to explore, this idea of like the myth of wellness, and what is wellness really, when so many of us are getting hooked by far-right extremism, right, by this fascist dictator, by conspiracy theories, when so many of us are using wellness as an excuse to escape reality, right, or deny people's lived experiences, or bypass or spiritually bypass, right, what is real and true, or ignore, or be neglectful of history. And so that's when I really started to sort of like peel the onion, what I call the myth of wellness, and also really grapple myself with what is in fact wellness, really, beyond what we've inherited, and what is my right role and responsibility in all that.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot to think about. And I know first you had to remove the knife from your back, right? After people surprised with their behavior. But I feel like to a large extent for a while, it felt like maybe as a nation, we were just going to continue to ignore these issues. Mm-hmm. And then it felt like the silence that the pandemic forced on everybody really allowed a lot of us to start contemplating, what are we really doing? And so much of even the language that you see around a lot of wellness products and programs seem to insinuate that if you follow all the rules, you're going to live forever, which we know is not a thing. And it really, for a lot of people, is a way for them to just not engage with life. Mm-hmm. Especially if you have a certain bit of access to privilege, you can just fully immerse yourself in a wellness path and desensitize yourself to other people's pain and focus on your own experience. And you would think if people were internalizing some of the values from the yoga community and other similar wellness communities, that it would be impossible for them to not be intersectional and to not be concerned about everybody's liberation and well-being. Because how well can you be if the world at whole continues to put up obstacles to you being able to feel safe at home in your body, or safe period, like walking down the street, you know. But it's interesting how many people have not decided to use the information that way.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, how many, I feel like so much of what the pandemic revealed is what's been there all along, right? We know this, like, none of this was new. All of it had been brewing for a really long time, you know, built upon legacies, upon legacies, upon legacies. And it was undeniable, right? Like, our interdependence was undeniable given all of the accelerating crises we were facing, from climate change to a global pandemic to extreme, like, our struggles were connected, and we couldn't, it was no, I just feel like it was impossible for us to tease them apart anymore.
Right.
And I just want to, like, name that. I feel like people, like, there was a moment where people saw that, and then there was a moment where it became intolerable for people, and folks were desperate to go back to normal. Enter wellness, you know what I mean? Right? Which, like, sold people the promise, right? That you could return to normal, or worse, that you could take this immune protocol and transcend, you know, a
What
contagion.
everyone else is going
Oh
through.
my God, right? Absolute absurdity. And so, anyway, so I just wanted to name this sort of like this tug, right? Where people were like, you know, because I do believe in the stillness and the silence and the slowing down. People saw in a different way. And yet I wonder if our tolerance, you know, was limited, so much so that even though we were all, I think, changed and shifted and shook, we were desperate to return to normal.
Yeah, you definitely see people reacting differently to what we all have been living through. Some people have decided to pretend the pandemic's not happening, and some people have decided to pretend there's no need for any kind of social justice advancement, and to just turn away from it because it makes them so deeply uncomfortable. So what were some of the reasons why, if any, you didn't feel like this message needed to come forward any sooner? Or was there any stickiness around what your place was in delivering the message? Because we came to a lot of similar conclusions. Like, it feels like the thesis of both books is definitely aligned, but our lived experience is wildly different.
Yeah.
You know, our proximity to power and relationship to white supremacy is very, very different.
Yeah.
So was there anything that made you feel like you weren't sure how to engage in the conversation?
Yes, everything is the answer to that question. I love that you said that, because I was struck by that too, and I feel like I also, like, learned a lot, right, from, like, the different perspectives and the different locations and the different lived experiences we both brought to this very similar analysis. And for me, I feel like the question I held going into this book writing process, and then most definitely every single day of the way, is like, what is my story to tell? What is my right role and responsibility in this conversation, right? Given the fact that I'm, like, a white, cis, straight, you know, non-disabled woman with so much proximity to privilege, so much proximity to, like, what we know to be the dominant definition of wellness, right? And I don't know that I believe that is actually wellness, but what we see on TV, or what we read in magazines, or what's sold to us by the wellness industrial complex. And so I really struggled with that, and I still have lots of questions about it, right? Because I can only share from my own lived experience, right? And yet I'm hyper aware that my perspective, right, has been the dominant narrative that has been telling the story of what wellness is, what wellness should be. So anyway, so, like, I tried to take on the role of questioning everything we've been told, of really challenging, like, the dominant narratives, the myths, I called it, that were sold by wellness, which is really just a reenactment, right, of what I believe is dominant culture, which is why, you know, I called this book American Detox and not Wellness Detox, because I was like, oh, no, wellness is not unique. It's just a microcosm of a much larger toxic ideology and culture. But yeah, I struggled with that all the time. And and I still do, and I actually think it taught me a lot about relationship, right? Because I knew then that I couldn't write this book in isolation. And so my editor was a trans man who literally like walked with me the entire way and held my feet to the fire of accountability and really challenged me to only tell my own story, right? But also to like, to pull up and question all of the things that I had assumed. My researcher was a neurodivergent disabled woman. So anyway, so I had a lot of people around me that were reflecting back to me often what I couldn't see because of the limitations of my lived experience, right? That's really like what I really got to in writing this book, is that I was very limited, I was compromised because of my proximity to power and to wellness and to all the things. And so I had to invite all of these people in and then really allow myself to be accountable. So anyway, and I'm still kind of like always in that question of like, what is, and I'm curious about this with you as well, right? Because like we're two people now in a shared conversation, in a shared discourse around decolonizing wellness, detoxing wellness. What do you feel like is like your unique role, right? In like moving this conversation forward and disrupting this idea?
I felt like it was really important to speak directly to marginalized people, to speak directly to LGBTQIA+ people, directly to Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, because it's so rare. Like you said, a lot of people maybe wouldn't question what's my place in this conversation coming from the dominant culture. They would just come in and like explain racism to Black people. People love to do stuff like that. And
I've done that.
Well, I appreciate that you own it.
Oh, totally.
When you see everyone modeling it, how would you know that that's not cool or that it's super anxiety provoking to the people who are on the receiving end? Because you also feel like when someone's explaining something to you, that you actually have the lived experience and probably also professional or educational experience to know the whole thing, like forwards and backwards, and you've been living in it, but you don't feel safe contradicting or countering what any white person says. Yes. And it feels so weird to say that in 2022 in mixed company, because for so long it's just part of the culture, the nature of living in the United States as a Black person. But I really had to reckon with all of the traumatic educational experiences I've had with white women in a position of power. That's typically who the teacher is because of how the patriarchy works, who does the helping professions, right? So who are the teachers? They're mostly people assigned female at birth. And because I was born in the early 80s, a lot of my teachers were people who literally marched through glass, did all they could to stop integration from happening. If those are your teachers, imagine what your experience is of countering anything the teacher says. And as a child, you don't have the context to understand where is all this hostility coming from? Why do I keep getting in trouble for just asking questions? But as an adult looking back, well, it only makes sense that I would have this fear of questioning even a white female peer, because historically it meant, a changed grade that changed like out of the blue, and then your parents have to come and attempt to advocate for you in a system that also doesn't want to hear anything they have to say. So it's been helpful to be more compassionate with myself, to understand where did some of this baggage come from. But the more I'm able to give myself compassion, the more room I have to understand that other people were raised in these systems too. They didn't opt in. So even though I have a ton of patience for some of those teachers, they were not nice, right? But you think about it, they were raised to buy into white supremacy culture. You don't get to opt in. As a child, you just absorb everything. And if you don't, as an adult, start to question, where did all of this come from? Is this actually how I want to be? Does this serve me? Does this even fit my values? How could you possibly ever break away from it? So it was interesting to hear you be so transparent about how you came to realize the areas in which you weren't contributing to the solution. You're perpetuating what was already there, and how you're able to course correct and acknowledging even now there's no way to be right all the time. It's not an option. So if we want to be part of anything that's going to improve what we have right now, we have to understand we're going to make mistakes constantly. That's what humans do. And there will always be somebody who doesn't like the way you phrase something. So there's like different levels that sometimes we really and truly are just wrong, and we have to be comfortable with the fact that humans are frequently wrong. But then there's also, everybody has an opinion, right? And if you write anything, the minute you finish it, you may think, I should have said it differently. But is that helping everyone else? Like at some point you have to decide, how am I going to be part, or how am I going to incorporate my work into this greater mission of health equity for everybody? And you have to get out of your own way and accept that it's okay to make mistakes in front of a lot of people. And it's also okay for people to think that everything you do is trash, even though other people love it. I mean, what are you gonna do? Someone's gonna hate it. So that, I think, is one of the hardest things about writing, is accepting that it's not your job to determine how other people will receive it. If you have a message and it's burning to get out of you, you just put it out there, and in the end, how people interpret it or use it, that's their business, not really our business.
I love that so much, and I just raise like snacks all around. I just want to say that's so freaking hard. I just want to admit that part. I know that this book wasn't written for me. I want to say that I think all the white folks should read this book for that exact reason. And I also want to say that so much of what you were just naming, and I'm just thinking about the section in this book that says miss us with the faux allyship. Like, I was reading this book and I was going, I did that, I've done that, I've done that before. And I actually think it's important for white folks who are actually trying to find themselves in this work and be accountable, be in integrity, right, and grow and learn, to actually do that, like to read and be like, shit, like that's me, I've done all those things, right, and also to learn from people who are having a completely different lived experience than them. So I just want to name that, like, I know that, because you were very clear, like, this book is not for you, and I was like, but I need to read this book.
Well, hey, I want everybody to read the book,
so that's the moral of the story. Everybody read this book.
What's funny was I initially thought, and this is a recurring theme I find in like lots of different kinds of people want to focus their business on a population that is not like part of the majority where they live, or maybe just power-wise is not the dominant group. You think that if you speak to someone else, you'll miss out on all these magical white dollars, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna do it. Oops, sorry. But the more I spoke to actual like white friends and family, they're like, no, because everything is always for me. Even when something clearly says it isn't for me, I still pick it up and I don't even think about it. And I thought, wow, that's such an interesting blockage that was just in my mind. It's how I interpreted my experience of racism in the South, was that would be possible. But I've had a lot of really positive feedback from cis white het women who learned so much from it and felt like their level of personal freedom in their own body increased as they read it.
Yes, I second that. I totally resonate. I want to pick up on something you were just describing around, I'm going to go off script, by the way. Just being transparent. This is our like facilitator moment. Around how we've been shaped, and we've been shaped in really different ways, but like shaped nonetheless, right, by dominant culture, by the legacy of white supremacy, capitalism, individualism, colonization that we've inherited, and that there's no escape, right? And I was just trying to like look for it, but in here you say something around how once you see it, you can't unsee it, which I loved. And I think I want to ask about that, because I feel like you were just alluding to that around how, I think especially during the pandemic, a lot of people saw it, right? Like it was like, you couldn't not see it, y'all, right? Like it was like, and whether it was that we're interconnected and that we're all sort of vulnerable in different disproportionate ways to this global pandemic, but also like you couldn't deny systemic racism, right? Like that, like so much is being revealed and exposed. One of my favorite words is apocalypse, which the etymology of that word means to unveil, It was like an unveiling, right? It's like one of my favorite things. So it was like such a great unveiling of what has always been there. But I think my question for you is around, is it enough to see? Is it enough to like, right? Because like, I know I'm thinking about the black square on Instagram, right? Like a lot of people performing wokeness, performing allyship, having a cognitive analysis, but maybe not an embodied and accountable one. What do you think about that?
I think it's so easy for people to just do the least to appear socially acceptable. And it also feels like culturally that is such a core, like, toxic American thing, is our attachment to politeness. And this is more than anything else like a white American thing. And I think it comes from bringing together so many distinct cultures with slightly similar complexions and squishing them all together and saying, we're just gonna be white now. Never mind all that other
Flattening.
all the complexity of the cultures from which people came, is that you really strive to just get along and not make any waves. And so if something seems to now be socially unacceptable, you don't want to be seen openly engaging in it. So some people putting up the square was probably, I want people to know I understand that being overtly racist is out of style. And I am keeping up, right? So I've got my square, I'm all good. But I think someone who really is a feeling person, or a person who's really compassionate, seeing it should be enough. Because you can't forget it and you can't let it go when you realize somebody else is suffering on a level that you didn't even know. You'll want to know how you can help, and you'll want to know how you can not constantly be hurting people around you that you consider to be friends and loved ones. But there are not enough people that are compassionate. That's something that can be developed. It's also something that can be trained out of you. And to a large extent, I feel like it's been trained out of most people in a society where profits always matter more than people. And the discomfort of one white person could be more important than the fact that other people are dying at traffic stops. So if you've been raised in a world in which that makes sense, you know, that your feelings can be more important than someone else's life, then yeah, you can see it, you're not gonna do anything except performative stuff that's not fooling anyone anymore. And it's interesting how many people have gotten really paranoid about cancel culture, which I'm not convinced exists. I think that if you keep showing people that you're not safe, you're kind of a jerk, people are gonna wanna hang out with you. Like, that's just logic, right? So the way some people are like, I don't want to say anything because I'm just afraid I'm going to get attacked and get canceled. Well, if you try to half-ass it, if you try to fake it, then that is a very real risk. Now, if you're really trying from your heart and you're doing the best you can, some people who maybe don't have the capacity at this moment for any compassion maybe will write you off. But by and large, other people who are self-aware, who know they make mistakes all the time too, will know this is another person trying their best, and you know, they've made this misstep, they've owned it, they'll try and do better in the future, and you can move on. But it's the sincerity that makes people give you more grace. But if all you ever did was put up a black square, and then you never in your life said anything else about equal rights or liberation, that was the funniest thing to me. All these companies that thought we wouldn't notice, that if they just said at this moment, oh, we just noticed that Black Americans don't like all these reminders of enslavement, that Black people don't think it's cute, that Aunt Jemima's, that's not cute, that Mammy and playing Gone with the Wind every 2 minutes, that's not cute, you know, we just realized that, so we're gonna back off of it for a second, mind you, because it's still playing now. No one, who's gonna fall for that? You had all this time and you never indicated you had any interest in what other people's emotional experience was around this content before. You know, who's gonna fall for that?
Well, and you're making me also think about, like, for the sake of what, right? Like, I think when I think about woke capitalism or like greenwashing, whitewashing, rainbow washing, often the bottom line is always profits, right?
Always.
It's right, it sells, right?
Yeah.
To get political in a particular kind of way, in a particular moment, right? Given the context of how the world is changing. And I even think that about like performance performative allyship, right? That for a lot of white people, it's more about being seen as being good
Yes.
than it is about caring, right? That people are suffering, right? Or that we live in a deeply unequal and unjust system, right? And that we come from a deeply unequal and unjust history. And so I'm just thinking about that too, like for the sake of what feels like right? Because otherwise we're going to keep getting caught in the same loop where we end up, right? We arrive at the same place, which is the place of profits over people. You just said that, or which is the place of like, and you and I talked a lot about Christian indoctrination. We both come from backgrounds, and I'm just thinking about like how I was taught to be a good Catholic girl, and how that really shaped me, and it governed a lot of why I did what I did. It wasn't so much because it was the right thing to do, it was because it was important for me to be seen and acknowledged as so-called good, right?
Right.
And then it become the good activist or the good white person, or right, which we know is not a thing. That's actually not how white supremacy functions.
See, and that, even though I almost forgot that I wanted to incorporate some of the content directly from your book into our conversation, that triggers this one, because I love this. The chapter is called Wellness Beyond Whiteness, and you specifically say, one of the great misperceptions that keeps white supremacy alive is the belief that white supremacy is about bad people doing bad things. And that's not what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone who isn't in the Klan and who doesn't actively,
It's off the hook.
yeah. And so a lot of people really feel, if I am not a hateful person, that's it, I've done enough. That being a person who's not racist versus a person who is anti-racist, these are very different things. And I think about over the years, in the history of this country, there were people screaming that slavery was wrong, while other people were fully acting like it was okay, right? So people who say, when we look at historical things, you can't judge it by this time, it was a different time, people didn't know. That's not true, okay? People knew, and probably the people who were actively participating in it on a level, unless they fully bought into the fact that most people didn't want to accept that all humans, regardless of complexion, it's the same creature. We're, not that different. The concept of race really scientifically doesn't hold water. But let's assume you didn't fully buy into that. Everybody knew what they were doing was wrong. But some people, if something's socially acceptable, feel comfortable doing things that are immoral. And some people do not. So there were always abolitionists, there were always white people who died because they were fighting inequality. Now, whether or not those people would measure up to our current standards is, unlikely, right? But still, considering the times that they were in, it is possible to do the right thing and to listen to your own moral compass, regardless of what's going on around you. And people have modeled that for us for centuries.
Yeah, so my favorite quote about white supremacy that really helped me understand how culture works is by this spoken word poet named Guante. And he says that white supremacy is not the shark, it's the water. And it's funny because I feel like I set out to write a book about wellness, but I actually ended up writing a book about culture because then I was like, oh my God, what is the water that we're being steeped in, right? Like, what is the water that we're swimming in, or what is the air that we're breathing? And what does that mean about what we're constantly internalizing? And we're internalizing, you and I, very different things, right? We're getting very different messages from dominant culture based on our lived experience and our racial identities and our social locations. But nonetheless, we're like breathing in really toxic messages about who we're supposed to be according to this hierarchy of bodies that isn't necessarily who we are.
Right.
And that was like a huge, whoa for me in terms of like the nature of the work, and also like what it's going to take to heal and to get free. And I feel like you write so much about that when you're writing about, okay, so I'm going to read something that you wrote. ultimately, body liberation is about freeing yourself from the commodification of your body, rejecting the use of your body as a tool of capitalism, and claiming your freedom. It's about abandoning colonized ideas of acceptability and reclaiming the freedom to live your life on your terms and use your body as a vehicle for your pleasure and exploration of the world. And what I love about that, and I feel like this is what I was trying to grapple with also in American Detox, is how it's not just about what we believe and what we think. What you're talking about is like embodied liberation. It's like, how do we free our bodies? Not necessarily free our minds of thoughts and ideas, but like what's stuck in our bodies and how do we get free?
Because really, if you try to liberate yourself from here down, it just doesn't work. Because even right on a level, I knew that it didn't make sense for me as an adult to feel like someone was gonna jump out of the bushes and discipline me the way you would a fourth grader. I just had that toxic history trapped inside me. So when your nervous system identifies a threat, it doesn't just let it go when your brain realizes this is not a threat to us anymore. You know, we're grown now. We can advocate for ourselves. It's not the 80s anymore. But you still have that gut reaction when you come across something that reminds you of something that was previously unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
And unsafe doesn't necessarily mean you physically thought something was going to happen to you. It means maybe you thought you were going to lose your sense of belonging. You were going to get fussed at in front of a group of people. You were going to be ashamed. You were going to be embarrassed. You were going to be made to feel less than. It feels so bad. I mean, everybody remembers instances of that happening to them in early childhood as a teenager, where all somebody did was shame you, but you really felt like you could die right there on the spot. You don't want to re-experience that. So, of course, your whole body is going to continue to push you away from anything that you think could lead to that. Even when you know up here, you know, well, I would shut that down because I'm grown. And I can explain to someone how their non-compassionate behavior is deeply unaligned with my personal values, and I refuse, you know, to take what you're saying seriously. No, you're just gonna run thinking that something bad is gonna happen if you don't stop to really start doing the work and noticing how does it feel when you are getting to that place of I need to run, I need to get out of here, or completely shutting down. And is there anything you can do to break the pattern or to complete the cycle of that experience? Like if you're in a office setting and someone tells you, you know, don't cry, we don't do that here, but you need to fully express an emotion that came up for you. If you don't finish that cycle, you know, it lives with you. It usually stays stuck. So typically as a child, you're constantly being told, you know, you're here to learn how grown-up people do things, right? Just follow along and don't have any feelings. That's usually the instructions. So there's all these incomplete cycles of feelings that we have trapped in our body, and it really takes time to start working through it, but you're going to have to feel something to work through it, which is the part that sucks. Like, I don't want to die. Like, there's not like a pain-free way to get through all of this. Like, you need to feel your feelings so you can move through them. They're there to give you information, but you're not meant to be stuck with the same ragged-ass feeling from a bad experience from 20 years prior. That isn't how it's supposed to work. That's frequently how it does work because we don't get to complete the cycle so you can move through it.
I love that you're talking about trauma, and I know you talk about this in the book as well. And I feel like if people understood, I mean, this is why the body is so relevant to your point, right? Because when people understand that trauma is not an idea in your head or an event that happened to you, it's a pattern, it's literally a shaping, right? It's a response mechanism in your body, then you realize that the work of liberation lies in the body. But it made me also think about, again, how dominant culture makes it really hard. Because my understanding of sort of our biological wiring is that we are constantly scanning, right, and evaluating our circumstances and our environment to answer the question, am I safe? Do I belong? Do I matter, right? And when we're not able to answer that question for ourselves, dominant culture answers it for us.
And the answer is no, no, and no.
Well, actually, and the answer is also like, some of you are safe and some of you aren't.
Yeah.
Some of you belong and some of you don't, right? Some of you get to be valued and others, some of you get to be well and some of you don't, right? So it's like, so even messier, right? Like it's disproportionate, it's different based on different bodies. And that's where I was like, holy shit, like how hard it is to regulate ourselves when we're swimming in these really messed up narratives about who gets to be well, who gets to thrive, and who doesn't, and how do we unhook ourselves from that?
And what do you do when the people who have decided to go into healing fields or any kind of healthcare related field, what do you do when they haven't acknowledged, that it's the water and that you really can't opt out of it? All we can do is push against it when we identify it in ourselves and work and work and work to try and detangle ourselves and just start questioning everything and understanding that we've all been socialized. You didn't get to decide how you're going to be socialized, but now as an adult, this is the time to start questioning why you came to believe all the things that you believe, and all those decisions that you make like in an instant without even thinking about it. Those are definitely informed by how you were socialized. Otherwise, you'd have to stop and think and mull it over. So
It's like, how could
slow
we
it
not?
down.
Yeah.
Right.
And in some ways, I want to say, because I want to ask you about shame, because you write so beautifully about shame in this book, and I'm thinking about, for those of us who are like, yes, I'm here for a week. I'm here to become aware of how deeply shaped and socialized I am, how I've been trained literally to play my assigned roles, and how I'm just thinking about how pervasive and perpetual that cycle is. Like, one of the things I talk about in the book is like, it's not like I became aware of this and it was over. Like every day I'm still like, imprinted by this barrage, right, of influence from every direction, especially from wellness. And I'm thinking about how when one is brave enough, right, and courageous enough to be like, okay, I get it now, I'm indoctrinated, I'm shaped, one of my favorite words, and this came from a book called Against Purity by Alexis Shotwell, and she says, we are compromised. We are all compromised. So she says, once we accept the fact that we are compromised, then we can skillfully work from that place as opposed to bypassing it or pretending it's not there. But my question for you is, shame, right, then often, right, is the impulse that arises when we get to that like, oh shit, I'm compromised place. And I'm just curious, like how we should work with shame, right? Because I know shame is unproductive, but the awareness feels critical, right? It's just like this fine line of like being willing to be uncomfortable in that awareness without spiraling out into. So help us understand that line.
I think awareness is the big part, knowing that the shame isn't going to help anyone else and it isn't going to help you. So it's okay to feel it, but when you recognize that that's all it is and that you're not doing anything by staying in that spiral, it's easier for you to identify, what could I do that might actually make a difference? Whether it's a difference in myself or a difference in the world of people, the lives of people around me. I think that sometimes when you don't know what you could possibly do to affect any change, shame feels like you're doing something because, hey, I'm born white and I have all this privilege and I can't do anything about it, but maybe if I just like flagellate myself or something, that counts for something. Right. But just one person suffering, how is that helping? And it's not changing anything. So it's important to really look for an actionable thing that you can do and to know that your brain's just grasping for something because you don't know what to do with knowing that things are not right and that there was a time where you either didn't care or maybe it just looked like you didn't care. A lot of it too with shame is our perception of how other people will reject us once they realize we've done something wrong or made a mistake. So I think a lot of the shame is coming from, oh, while I was unaware of this, who noticed? That feels like one of the first things that comes out was like, did everybody know except for me?
Right.
What were people talking about it? Like, do people think of me as like this brainwashed person? Because in my book, where the shame comes up is realizing that you have internalized white supremacy as a person who is not white. The first thing is like, ugh, who saw it? Who noticed it before I noticed it? But what good does that do? It is what it is. You can't unbake this cake. You can't like change everything that's happened to you that made you who you are. All you can do is keep analyzing what you're working with now. Is it serving you? Is it serving the people around you? Is it in alignment with your values? Keep trying to push away what doesn't fit and move forward.
You're also making me think about how shame is a function of white supremacy. Like, white supremacy wants us to get stuck in shame because it means we won't do anything, right? And so it becomes like a weapon of what, like, yeah, you should be ashamed. Go off and be ashamed, because therefore you won't do anything. You'll get stuck there, you'll spiral, you'll expend all of your energy in that place, and you won't do the productive thing, right, of pushing back or challenge. So I'm like, oh, and then, right, therefore it functions to serve white supremacy and uphold it because it keeps us stuck.
Because I've had, one of the things that I've had a lot of people ask me, like in the last 3 years or so, as white people have been asking, like, well, is it even appropriate for me to say anything? Should I even be seen? And it almost feels like they're coming to you, just the shame is just oozing, right? And I'm not seeing where that helps anybody outside of the person, but it makes sense as a function of opposing real shifts in the culture. I think it makes so sense to build that in to the status quo so that people don't see anything that they can do. It's that all they see is a way to stay stuck and keep spiraling.
We're about to shift in a moment to questions, but I think I want to ask you as our last question to each other. What is like, so this may or may not preempt a question that y'all have, but what is like the number one question you've gotten from folks in and around sort of the coming out of your book?
So interesting, like from media and from people who weren't squarely in the target, is it just okay for like everybody to be fat? Are you saying that just being fat's okay forever? And it's just interesting to me, it's like, that's what you got from
You're like, did you read the book?
Oh my God. Sorry. I think that's the right response. My argument would be, it's okay for all bodies to just be. And I am not going to claim that there is never any reason why somebody might want to try to change the size of their body. But the point is that should always be an individual decision. And bullying people and making people feel less than for any reason is never acceptable under any circumstances. And even when I think about my lack of compassion sometimes towards people who are like fully committed to white supremacy, I also know that even when I am like, well, I don't have time for these people and I don't care what they think and blah, 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 that may just mean I'm not called to serve them. But me engaging with them that way will never produce any change either. So, but at least I know and I leave them alone, right? I'm not going out and trying to have meaningful conversations with plants. But it's just interesting when you really think about it, when has it ever helped anybody change to be like smacked around and told like, you have no value because you have misunderstood something. It just doesn't work. It doesn't create any change in anyone. No matter how justified you are and being so frustrated with the person.
Which is fair. Yeah. All right.
Ready for questions?
Anybody have any? I know we have some questions from the interwebs.
Yeah, so let's start with our virtual question asker, and then we'll encourage folks in the room. So our friend Brenda, watching virtually, says, do you have any thoughts on how to introduce these topics to care partners? I am dependent on outside care for my life, and I often get dealt with, not with malice, but ignorance. under the guidance language of wellness myths?
That's a tough one. When the power dynamics are off and you need that person to still be open to helping you and engaging with you, I think the easiest thing from my perspective is to come at it just open-hearted and saying how it's making you feel, and ask them, would you be willing to consider, not saying this type of thing to me anymore because this is how I feel. And to make it about you so that they don't immediately get triggered and feel like, somebody saw me doing something wrong, and so they don't start to feel defensive and caught up in the shame. If it can be put out that way as a request, and would you consider? I mean, if somebody says what's happening, is making me feel bad, it's having a bad impact on me, and you say, would you consider changing? If they say no to that, I don't know who you're stuck with.
Yeah, the first thing that came up for me was I just was thinking about how undervalued and unappreciated care work is in our country. So I was like, and how so just like that within our culture, care is not valued, and care workers are not paid and are not appreciated. And so acknowledgement right? I mean, one of the most fascinating things that I discovered in writing the book is how most care work is not reflected in our GDP, which is mind blowing to me. Caring for your children, caring for elders, much of our care work is actually not a part of our economic consideration. So I was thinking about that just as context. And then I was also thinking about what it looks like to create, I'm just thinking about mutual care and how do we create, and I know that we don't always have the conditions for this, but how do we create conditions where there's accountability and multiple care partners so caretakers know that they're being held accountable to being in integrity, right? And to also meeting the needs of the person
Right.
who they're caring for, as opposed to projecting what they think they need onto other people. And so what does it look like for us to enroll our family members, our neighbors, or other, and how do we build that? I'm just thinking about what the mutual aid community has taught us, and how do we build networks and webs and capacity for care that isn't dependent on one person,
Right.
but can actually be accountable to many people.
There's a great book called Birth Strike, The Hidden Fight Over Women's Work by Jenny Brown that is literally about making an economic argument for care work, and specifically why that is a feminist idea. And so if folks have not read that, it's a great book, just as an aside.
I feel like we could make a whole book list of that question alone. I'm thinking about Mutual Aid by Dean Spade. I'm thinking about care work by Leah Lakshmi Pyepsna Samar Sinha. I'm thinking about Beyond Survive. Sorry, I'm just going through the list of all of the people who have taught me, and especially people who have disabled experiences, right, whose bodies don't fit into dominant structures and dominant systems, and they know best what it is to take care, right? We could listen and learn so much from folks who have been marginalized by abled systems.
One of the things that we saw this a lot in our community at the beginning of the pandemic was people with disabilities in our community who rely on paid care workers were really struggling with not being able to set boundaries out of fear and desperation, because it was so hard to find care workers who had the same COVID protocols as them and had the same values, and the world got smaller and smaller and smaller. And I hear a little bit of that in this person's question of it's the power dynamic, but also the fear of it's not always possible to set boundaries in the way that you might with a friend, or and that's really scary and hard. But I think practicing when you're alone, saying it over and over again, this is what I need, this is what I like.
And I'm sorry. You do find that a lot of people are so unfamiliar with boundary setting that they get very upset when someone sets a boundary with them. But I know the people that I've seen in my work life and personal life that consistently set boundaries with everyone and they don't back down, eventually people will get used to it. But it doesn't mean that all those conversations are pleasant, and it doesn't mean that there's not a period where the person becomes uncooperative and unavailable, which has got to be extremely difficult if you know you actually need that person to remain cooperative and available.
It's also making me think about I'm thinking about normalizing that we need things. And I'm just thinking about so much of the ideology that fuels wellness, right, is like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's the self-made man. It's toxic individualism. It's that if to ask for help is to be weak, right? Or to need support is to be a failure, and how how dehumanizing, how unhuman that is, right? And so how do we, in culture, in our conversations, in our relationships, start to normalize that we need help, and how do we start to ask for help, right? And so I'm just thinking about that too, how like, what does a culture of care look like, where not even just about boundaries, but where it's like commonplace to share agreements, right? Like, hey, what are our agreements? Do we, how do we want to be together? What does care mean to you? What does care mean to me? What do you need in this relationship? What do I need in this relationship? What do we do when there's conflict? Like, those kinds of conversations are not a part of our dominant discourse. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we do the nice thing where we either ignore the conflict, or we get defensive, or we leave, or, we
talk to everybody except the person whose behavior needs to change about it.
Or we say positive vibes only, which is my least favorite thing to hear.
But even asking that question is helpful to everyone who's heard the question, because now we can think, like, are there situations where someone in my life feels vulnerable and they're dependent on me? Have I made it safe for them to tell me when I am making their experience worse?
Does anyone in our local room want to ask a question?
Yeah, I want to say. Oh, thank you. My name is Laura, and I'm from Ecuador. So I am a migrant, immigrant woman. And I grew up in a completely different environment. Not like the US, obviously. I more grew up with the indigenous people in Ecuador. And just by luck, I have gone through different changes until I am living in Decatur, Georgia. But it's a long trip, long journey. And what you are talking about, it comes to me first, the word water, trauma, and feeling shameful. I think those words are very descriptive, but I feel as a person from outside of the culture who grew up now with this culture. So I tend to think differently, and I tend to think not that I'm good and the other person is bad at all. It's just that, like the word, I feel is our society or the environment that we grew up in it. And in my case, I tended to observe who were swimming because I was terrified to get in the water. And that allowed me to learn a lot from observation, how everybody was swimming differently or doing different things. But at one point, I was pushed into the water, and I realized that the only thing that could stop me is to learn how to swim, meaning education, getting educated, so that you will be able to learn different, like I had traveled a lot at 26 countries, and so I was able to learn from other cultures. And just like we eat, everybody eats potatoes, but they fix differently. So we eat the same, and we are the same, except that we grew up in different environments, so we learned how to do different things, you know. And then for me to jump in the water was a very traumatic experience because I did not know how to swim. And that created a terrible emotional pain of love and rejection and all kind of things. But at the same time, I realized that is what it helps you learn, is the fact that you are in pain. And you were talking about COVID. I had COVID twice, but I never went to go to the hospital. Just knew that I had to do different things at home in order to survive. But other people would say, "Are you crazy? You have to be in the hospital." I go, "No, I would get even sicker, so I'm not going there." But it's just how frightened they were because that was something new, and most of the people here in the United States, they have not gone into traumatic experience. So for me, of course, personally, I see it's not like a big deal, but obviously for someone who has never gone through any traumatic experience, it was a big deal. And they change it, the perspective a little bit. But now it's like, okay, we had that and we need to go back to normal. What is normal? What is a normal now? It's a completely different normal, right? And then start feeling shameful if we actually know who we are inside of us, and we grew up differently and with different perspectives and experience, then we cannot feel shameful. And everybody is equal. The same. Thank you.
I think it is really important to acknowledge, how you're raised and where you're raised totally influences your worldview. And so I liked that you framed this as an American detox because some of the things we're going through, it's not universally applicable.
Right.
One of my parents is half Afro-Cuban, half Jamaican. And so the worldview that I get from that side of the family, most of them having been raised in an all black school, all black this, all black this, their traumas are very different. And so, it's really beneficial, I think, to make sure you're interacting with people who have different experiences so that we can understand so much of this is our stuff. But it's impossible to encompass everybody's experience. That's why I love that different people can speak on the same thing and just give a different point of view. I mean, we're all standing around the same object and reporting what we can see from our angle, but only if you listen to everyone do you get a complete picture.
Yeah, I was in Europe last week talking about the book, and the woman that was interviewing me was from the UK, and she said, "Well, so how is this work different here than where you are?" And I go, "I don't know. How is it different?" You know what I mean? How would I know? So you're just making me appreciate how being in this conversation with people outside of your lived experience is really essential, because then we get to bear witness to the ways, because I believe that a lot of these patterns and paradigms, right, and ideologies, we know that they're shared because we know global history, right? We know that colonization happened everywhere. We know that white supremacy is happening in different places. And we also know that people are being impacted in very different ways by it. And I think it's important for us to have that level of nuance, and not, especially as people from the United States of America who tend to project and export our perspective onto the rest of the world forever. But the other thing I wanted to appreciate that you were talking about, that it made me just think about nature and how nature teaches us that we only thrive because of difference and diversity, right? And so when you were talking about potatoes, the many different kinds of potatoes, or the many different kinds of people swimming, or even the many kinds of lived experiences and traumas that people are experiencing, we only thrive by understanding and listening and bearing witness to one another. My friend Maytha Al-Hassan calls it engaged withness, right? And this idea of knowing ourselves as a part of something bigger than ourselves, and being fully engaged in like the ecosystem of who we are as a whole.
Correct.
So anyway, so I just wanted to appreciate the wisdom of what you're saying. It feels natural, right? Like our nature is that.
We are part of nature. If we accept that, then
We have forgotten.
like day and night, or the leaves get green and die, and I mean, we're just part of it. So it's always changing, moving. We cannot reject that.
Hi. So obviously I have a very similar lived experience as you, white, cis het woman. I'm from rural Pennsylvania, so that's a fun time. And I'm now just recently married to a person of color. And so this conversation really, really resonates with me, but every time I hear these conversations, in the back of my mind, it's like, what do I do when when somebody who gets it intersects with the family that doesn't get it? And the holiday season's coming up, lots of fun Thanksgiving conversations. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives, is like, do you think, it's worth continuing these conversations with people that I'm fairly certain it's never gonna click? And again, I don't think they're even getting to the point of shame. Like, it's just pure defense mechanism. Like, they just don't want to accept that, they're doing anything wrong to feel that shame. And, at what point, especially as someone who is married to a person of color, like, how much work should I put into that effort, other than, obviously shielding him away from that stuff? But like, do you think there's a point that where it's not worth our effort to have that conversation? Or is it, it's more worthwhile to, participate in, dismantling white supremacy in other capacities? Or, is it something that you really just have to put your foot down and keep fighting, even though you want to like scream and throw yourself out the window at Thanksgiving?
I think it depends on probably how close you want to stay to that family, and how much energy are you willing to pour into them, trying to find ways to appeal to their heart that a stranger would never be able to do, and then knowing how actively some groups of people have been brainwashing and hijacking the minds of white working class folks.
Yes.
And they're working on brainwashing them like every day.
Yeah.
It's in the programming they watch on TV, what they're listening to on the radio, and they probably have a lot of friends that are reinforcement, friends and family. So you might be the only voice saying something different.
Yeah. That's true.
So I think realistically, it's going to be hard to find the one thing that would make them say, wait a minute, I'm on the wrong path. But I think if you want to stay close to them, you keep putting the energy in. But I think it's good that you're aware that you want to shield the most vulnerable person, which is your partner. And then to think too, if you are planning to have more family in the future, like the two of you together, how safe will it be for those little people to be around this family? So these might be battles you're fighting for your spouse and for your unborn children.
I'll just add in terms of like bringing people along, I've found like modeling humility and curiosity has been like the most. So I've done all the things. I've like raged and cursed and brought like facts, and then brought my, and I've done like canvassing training, and I've done all the things, and I found that like actually being true to my own very messy, often mistake-making, humiliating journey to awakening, like being open, and has actually been the thing that's brought people in more than anything. And it's a process, it's a journey. So I just keep showing up with curiosity. And one of the things that I learned when I did this thing was, and so that's one thing. And to echo what you were saying, I just think you have to have boundaries, and you have to decide when it's worth the engagement and when it's not. And I'm thinking harm you know, like if your partner is being harmed, or you feel like your kids are being like shaped by the narratives or the ideology, that feels risky. Right? So like just getting clear about like what your lines are in the sand and knowing like when it's worth and when you need to pull out. And the only other thing I'll just share, this was a hard learning for me, but it was like another place whiteness showed up in a way that I couldn't see, is that I have also in my, you know, relationships with my Black friends have also played the role of shield without actually asking for consent. And have actually taken away their choice of like having their own experience. And so it's like been a bit like almost codependency or like paternalism or what, like it's been like a version of that, but with like a really great intention. So you know, I'm just sharing that too, because I've learned that the hard way, and I've had friends be like, you don't have to do that. Like, let me have my own experience. And if I need something from you, I'll ask. And I've been like, oh shit, okay. Here's another layer I need to learn, you know, just one more, you know. So anyway, so I just sharing that because I just literally learned that lesson yesterday.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate getting to hear from everybody and all of your questions, our friends in the virtual room as well as in here. So we are going to say thank you to our friends in the virtual room and let them know that they can purchase both of your books via this teal link at the bottom of the page. So go ahead and click that link. You can also support the work of Charis Circle by clicking the donate link now. It really does help us when you buy your books from Charis and when you support Charis Circle. We are so grateful for your support. We're going to say goodbye to you.